Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show. Hello, Laura. It's episode 30 of The Pick List. How's your week been?
It is episode 30. I can't believe it. Great week, thank you. I have done some training with the Institute of Directors about being a chair. I chair a couple of boards as part of my portfolio career, so it was fantastic to take a full day out talking about what I should be doing more of and definitely what I should be doing less of. How about you? What have you been up to?
I've also been doing quite a bit of training. As the trainer, not the trainee, I should say, I've been running some of my masterclasses which focus on writing skills, editing skills, and also pitching skills. So that's been exciting.
You'll notice this week we don't have an episode sponsor, so if you'd be interested in sponsoring the Pick List, please just visit the website and click on the sponsor button.
And we have a fantastic guest joining us for this week's episode. It's Emily Daw. Emily works in the strategic and corporate development team at Bakkavor, and she is super hot on all things FMCG trends, shopper behaviour, what's happening in the industry. So it was great to get her pick of articles and, of course, get her perspective on what's happening in the market at the moment.
Please do rate and subscribe to the Pick List. Let's start the show.
Emily, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh no, it's great to be on the podcast. I'm a keen listener, so dream come true to actually feature on it.
Oh, fantastic. We love to hear that. Emily, why don't you briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners how you're connected to food and drink?
Absolutely. So I'm Emily Daw and I'm part of the group strategy team at Bakkavor and lead sort of potential M&A opportunities as well as key strategic projects. So Bakkavor is the largest supplier of fresh prepared food into the UK grocery retailers. And, you know, some of you may not be familiar with Bakkavor as a household name, and that's because we're focused on own label products for the retailers. So you won't see Bakkavor on the packaging, but we've got a well-established presence in the UK. We've got 25 manufacturing sites doing a whole range of products that include things like chilled pizzas and ready meals and dips. So I'm sure most of our listeners will probably have bought some of our products in the supermarket. And whilst it's a smaller part of our business, we do actually also have some operations in the US and China, replicating what we do in the UK for the retailers.
Fantastic. And I know some of that sort of broad scope that you bring to your role is reflected in the articles that you've picked for us as well. And I know you're someone who spends a lot of time looking at consumer trends, shopper behaviour as part of what you do as well. So before we jump into your articles, I really wanted to ask you just your sense. We're still sort of just at the start of February. We're still looking ahead to what to expect this year. Could you just give us a sense of some of the key trends that you are personally really excited about for 2021?
I mean, I think it's one of those that's almost difficult to say in a way, because I think the year has started perhaps not as we expected, as not as we hoped, as it were, being in a lockdown again here in the UK. But really it's around kind of trying to see what sticks from, you know, all these shifts in consumer behaviours that we've seen through lockdown, with people cooking more at home, cooking from scratch. But also kind of supplementing their weekend treats with the takeaways and things. And I guess it's seeing how that falls out in the months to come, and ultimately the phasing of that will be driven, I think, in a large part by the extent to which restrictions get lifted in the UK around the lockdown. But I think also just in terms of the kind of momentum behind veganism and health, clearly has really stepped on this year again. I think I read, it was like 600,000 people that signed up for Veganuary officially this year, and it was 400,000 last year. So it's like huge, I guess, excitement and opportunity around that whole category and what that has to offer, and just the range of products in that space, which is really exciting.
Totally. And I think we'll get a couple of opportunities actually to dive into some of these trends, particularly health, but also that whole plant-based piece in a bit more detail with some of the articles we'll be talking about as well. Of course, as you know, the Pick List is all about sharing interesting articles about grocery and food and drink. So we do like to get that behind the scenes glimpse at our guests' reading habits. How do you keep up to date with what's happening in the industry? What does your reading routine look like? And what sort of publications do you like reading?
It's a funny one actually, because I found almost with the whole lockdown and the way things are virtually, that actually reading really long form pieces is quite hard work. So I find actually some of the things that are a bit more like bulletin, short and snappy, are easier to absorb. But I mean, the likely suspects in terms of like Kantar for the kind of data reports and the grocery trends, the grocer, food manufacturer, Just Food, all great sources of current news. Clearly from a grocery perspective, we get insight from our customers. So I'm tapped into our own marketing team and customer teams around that's getting kind of live feedback from the retailers themselves. So those are probably the key bits that I use.
Fantastic. Great. Now tell us about your first article for us.
Absolutely. So my first pick is an article from Food Manufacturer, which announces Unilever's trial of portable factories. So they explain that Unilever have effectively designed a manufacturing unit that operates within a 40-foot sea container, which can in theory be shipped to new locations across the world. And the unit itself's been developed for liquid bouillon, so like the stock. But they hope to use the technology for other food products such as ice cream and ketchup and mayonnaise. And they're kind of seeing this as a new opportunity to access new locations, make the most of local ingredients and be able to respond more quickly, in essence, to the sort of changing demand in local markets. I guess I found this really interesting as typically, to establish a manufacturing presence in a new market, it's a hugely lengthy process. You've got to assess that market opportunity, the range of products, establish a customer pipeline, recruit local people, and ultimately, make a huge investment to actually set up a factory and start up the business. And I guess this seems like it could provide a really sort of nimble, like low capital, low risk option to actually enter and sort of test the potential opportunity in a new market. And also sort of quite admired like the simplicity of the setup from what they described, because it definitely seems like Unilever have got the kind of developing markets in mind. It's only got one electricity cable and a single water hose to actually operate the unit. So it's a very much a sort of plug and play, and you're ready to go by the sounds of things. And then the other piece for me was just around the fact the units are all run centrally. Well, that's their kind of plan. And their Unilever's engineering manager sort of describes it as like a new dynamic model where thousands of nano factories could be run from a central system, allowing us to have flexible production lines wherever and whenever needed. So it's that sort of cloud-based control, harnessing the data in a centralized way that, again, it just adds to that flexibility. So it seems like quite an exciting opportunity, I thought.
I love this story and I hadn't spotted it, and I totally agree. It's a great opportunity. And as you say, you think for developing markets, this could work really well. The other thing I was thinking of when I read it, I thought this is perfect for these FMCGs to have presence at some of their key customers, isn't it? In terms of, you could see one of these parked outside Tesco's HQ at Welling and trying to get the buying team more involved with NPD and the processes that they go through. And I guess because in a post-COVID world, it'd be really interesting to see how much site visits are possible, that actually that can be maybe a bit tricky for the supply chain. So to keep that close connection with what's happening at a production angle through to their B2B customers, you can see these popping up. And maybe even, as we've chatted about on the show so many times, the whole D2C model, could we see these popping up randomly where consumers themselves can go and see how things can be manufactured with perspex sides. I don't know, I'm maybe even too far in the future, but I always think there's always this dark art of the supply chain, and people are talking so much about this transparency of the supply chain, and maybe Unilever have hooked onto something here that brings a consumer closer to it.
Yeah, I just think that whole local production angle that you highlighted, Emily, as well. I think that's so attractive, isn't it? Again, in light of COVID, so many companies are looking at bringing production closer to home, are looking at sort of taking out some of that complexity just to avoid some of the disruptions that we've seen when borders start closing. Again, in a post-Brexit or post-trade deal environment, also a key consideration. And just this idea that, here you have a sort of fairly straightforward out of the box setup that allows you to set up a local production unit, I think is really, really fascinating. I'd love to see how easy it is to scale that up to slightly more complex products than perhaps a bouillon. But I think the potential is fascinating, and again, that opportunity to potentially rent out these units in a sort of dark factory as opposed to dark kitchen model as well, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, it actually reminded me a little bit of InFarm. I don't know whether you're familiar with them, but the vertical farming group, that in a way the model reminded me of it, because it's that sort of cloud-based central control of their, salad herb growing units that they have. And this sort of sounded quite similar to that in a way.
Julia, what's your first pick this week?
Now, my first pick this week is from Reuters, and it's titled "British Lockdowns Drive Acceleration in Grocery Sales Growth." It's basically an article about the latest Kantar grocery market figures, which came out earlier this week, and which I was really interested to talk to you both about. The Reuters article pulls out a few key stats, but there's also a helpful article on the Kantar website itself, which is worth reading, and we'll link to it in the show notes. So what are some of the standout figures from that Kantar release? Well, first of all, there's a nice little stat about New Year's Eve. Lots of us ordered takeaway, I can certainly confirm that. And as a result, delivery companies such as Just Eat and Deliveroo accounted for 6% of all online shopping trips on the 31st of December, which I thought was a nice standalone little nugget of a stat there. But January, the big picture here is grocery sales have accelerated once more after Christmas, which is not a surprise given that that's when we went into national lockdown again. But it's always worth, I find, reminding ourselves of the scale that's involved here. So in January alone, says Kantar, shoppers spent £1 billion more on supermarket food and drink items compared with the same 4-week period last year. What did they spend that money on? Well, this is where things get interesting, and we're starting to talk about some of the sort of bigger trends that Emily talked about right at the start. So we had veganuary, of course. Vegan ranges were bought by 6.6 million households in January, which is an increase of 10% year on year. And overall sales of vegan ranges during January were up 23% compared with 2020. So really strong growth. We also had dry January, and so no and low alcoholic drinks did well. Sales of no alcohol beer in particular was up 12%. But for many of us, January wasn't particularly dry this year, and alcohol sales, in fact, grew by £234 million. That's up 29% year on year. And I thought this interplay between the no and low trend on the one hand and the increase in booze sales on the other is really interesting, because essentially you have what sounds like two diametrically opposed trends happening at the same time. And it reminds me of what's happening with plant-based and meat and dairy sales as well, and some of the confusion this sometimes creates. I remember when the Grocer's Top Product Survey results came out at the end of 2020, meat and dairy had done really well. They were among the top performing categories. And there was quite a bit of commentary on social media essentially saying, well, look at this, plant-based is clearly massively overblown because look at how well meat and dairy are doing. But plant-based was also doing very well, just from a much smaller base. Plus, of course, some of those meat and dairy figures would have been boosted by displaced sales from food service. So you can be in this sort of interesting situation where two seemingly contradictory things can be true at the same time. Plant-based is growing massively and meat and dairy have done very well. And no and low is a really significant trend, and booze sales have also done very well. And I just thought that was a particularly useful reminder to look at that nuance in these figures and to contextualize them, and I suppose be quite wary of black and white statements from either side, really. Everyone's going vegan versus plant-based is totally overblown, or no one's drinking booze anymore versus everyone's developing a really heavy drinking habit to get through lockdown. It's about looking at those different consumer groups that are looking for different things, and even acknowledging that individual consumers can experiment at times with quite contradictory trends within their lives. So, Emily, what did you make of that, particularly those Veganuary figures, and were there any particular stats that stood out to you in those in that Kantar release?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on there, just in terms of those sort of almost conflicting trends. I think I sort of termed it as like a polarization of trends. It's that kind of the other element being like health versus treats. And I think there's that, like, maybe during the week people are a bit more healthy, but actually they want to indulge a bit on the weekend because they can. And that kind of takeaway element probably plays into that, as well as potentially trading up to have a more premium treat potentially for a pudding or something. So I thought that was interesting. And then I guess the other element, just around the kind of online shopping component of the report, because I think they reported it's at record high 14% share in January, and it's equivalent to sort of 6.5 million users effectively, and it definitely just feels like that's here to stay, the online trend, and it's really sticking as well with the older demographics by the sounds of things, because we're all aware, obviously, with the sort of first lockdown there was that shift almost of the older demographic who previously would go to physical store, and sort of started to trial out online, but it's really shown that actually they're sticking with it, and then they're probably getting a good experience, and the risk factor, I guess, of going to physical stores is still there. So I thought that was kind of interesting to call out. I guess it'll be interesting to see how some of the trends post lockdown. So, are people who are buying more booze those people who would typically have bought it in a restaurant or in a bar or a pub, and therefore when we come out of lockdown, is that going to fall away, or are they just an underlying trend that's going to be here to stay with the more premium boozes as well as the no and low, as you call it?
I thought one of the elements that you pulled out there, Emily, I also spotted, and I thought was really interesting. The almost a third, 28% of online shoppers are retired, as you've alluded to, which I think is fascinating. And when you spend some time looking at these retailers' propositions online, some of them are quite complex and some of them aren't. And I think thinking of the sort of devices that these retired folks have, and I know that's a huge catchment, retired, but you're ranging from someone in the early 60s maybe that's got a load of tech and familiar with it, someone well into their 80s and maybe only got an old iPad, and retailers will need to be looking at how they can evolve this more and more. And I suppose maybe that could be one of the reasons that Morrison's are one of the big winners in that data and that report, that they pivoted so quickly, didn't they, in terms of, I guess, their vertical integration model, that they could do all these different boxes that we spoke about last season, and all these different meals and opportunities, and you could just ring up and you didn't have to order on a computer. It's really interesting about how they put all these different elements into play. But I love the Kantar figures when they come out, and having to watch Fraser's video to see his readout on it all. It's fascinating, and understandably very interested in the meat figures.
Yeah, totally. I think they headed it. The headline this time was sort of resolutions versus reality, which I thought was a particularly nice way of looking at how we'd actually behaved in January. But I think, Laura, the point that you're making about how retailers will look at their e-commerce sites and just making sure they're adapting to a wider range of demographics that are using them, I think is so true. And it's also just about evolving those websites more generally, because they are still quite functional, I'd say. There's not an awful lot around sort of storytelling and really, helping product discovery. So all of those big questions around How do you launch NPD successfully online if you're, a really big chunk of your target market is now discovering new products through online? Feels like we've got a long way to go until we have something that really gets to grips with that. Laura, what's your first pick for us?
So my first pick this week is cardboard. Last week I spoke about plastic, so there's a theme emerging. I don't know what I'm going to do next week. Watch this space. So my article is from the Sunday Times, and it's "Your wine deliveries delayed. Amazon has all the cardboard boxes." And I was really interested to see this story in mainstream press because it's something that I've been picking up from the trade actually for the last couple of months, both in the meat sector and other food sectors, struggling to get packaging at the lead time that they normally do. So I think that the Sunday Times does a fantastic job of putting it into perspective and speaking to some of the key players in the market. So basically what's happening is some of the big players like Amazon are saying in this article that they have a 12-month rolling cycle on planning what they need in terms of cardboard, and whereas some of these smaller niche suppliers like wine box services don't have such long lead times. They would normally order cardboard 2 to 3 weeks in advance and then it would be delivered, and that's been pushed out now to up to 5 weeks. And the Cardboard Trade Association is talking about there's 5 times the amount of demand there was pre-pandemic. And what that's meaning is that having to invest heavily, and there's a lot of capex going on in industry here, but that, as we know, that takes time to get up and running and to put into flow. And what this is all coming down to, the fact is, we are still recycling when we get our cardboard at home, but because we're recycling, and obviously that can sit in your recycling bin at home for a fortnight, the time it's collected, it puts a lag into the system. And whereas if you were a shop and you were putting cardboard into your recycling bin, then that would be, higher quantity, recycled more quickly, but there's this perceived recycle lag. The article spells out about the Amazon effect, which I thought was really interesting and really simple, but I hadn't really considered it. That now we would get a toy, for example, 10 toys would be in a single box for a retailer, and it would come and it would be easy to put that single box into the recycle. Now through Amazon, it's 10 boxes because it all comes through our letterbox. So the supply has just gone up. The demand has gone up and the supply obviously hasn't quite kept at pace. So in the short term, it's affecting lots of different players, lots of SMEs and those folks that just haven't got the long-term contracts. And even some bigger players that I've been speaking to in the food sector are struggling to meet that demand that their customer wants. Because it's really tough in a tight supply chain.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it really highlighted the kind of scale, I guess, of the impact of this change in buying habits over the last year and the shift in the consumer behaviour. And actually, sort of systemic change of this magnitude, I imagine, would typically be phased in over a period of years ultimately. And actually it's happened in less than 12 months. So it's sort of no surprise in a way that the supply chain is creaking a bit in response. But it's an interesting space, and I wasn't sure to what extent some of the indications from China around their recycling and the restrictions around what they're importing or not importing was having on this, because I think there was something last year which suggested they were no longer going to be importing sort of cardboard paper goods because the majority of recycling happens there. I don't think that's happened yet, but is likely probably to happen by the end of this year. But I didn't know whether there was an element of that at play here as well, in terms of the supply of recycled cardboard coming in from China. Maybe that's causing some of the hold-ups as well.
Yeah, so it's a really good point, and like you, I'm also not sure to what extent that is actually exacerbating the situation as well. So what you were just saying about having some of these, sort of systemic changes and shocks to the system that sort of happen suddenly rather than over a period of time. I did read in the US press over the past week that there are some reports there that the demand on dry ice as a result of vaccination programs, which of course, certain vaccines rely really heavily on that is starting to have an impact on some of their grocery supply chains in terms of delivery of certain goods. It's not something I've picked up on here, but it'll be really interesting to see whether that, again, is something that could potentially filter down.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there was also sort of in the summer last year, I think the BBC reported on what they called sort of beige gold. So it's all theft around cardboard. And actually, it's quite lucrative business to sell on cardboard to then be recycled. And they were citing issues in Spain where there were sort of gangs, effectively just taking all the cardboard out the recycling bins and off the streets, and people putting it out on the road for collection and selling it off to China effectively. And I guess you just wonder in the current environment now, if that cardboard supply chain is really under pressure, whether they that kind of cardboard theft is going to be on the rise.
Yeah, I know. It's a really good point. I do remember that article very well, because I remember seeing it and thinking, there's just always something. Wherever you look, there's like a fascinating backstory that you never thought of. Who'd have thought of cardboard theft? But once you start looking at the figures involved, you can see why there's a very thriving cardboard theft community out there as well. Emily, tell us about your second pick for us.
Yes, absolutely. So my second pick was an article where the title just caught my eye. So it's from The Guardian. It's called Grubs Up. Mealworms are on the menu, but are we ready for them? And the article actually starts with Sam Williston, the journalist, sort of very apprehensively describing his experience of eating a mealworm, which kind of made me laugh. So he says, dry because it's been dried, a little crunchy, not strongly flavoured, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Salt would probably help, or chili, or lime, something, anything to spice it up a bit, and definitely a beer if I was going to consume much more to help wash it down. So yeah, that caught my eye and intrigued me to understand more. But in essence, so mealworms are sort of small yellow grubs that are often used to feed birds. But many people think they could be a nutritious source of food with potential sort of environmental and economic benefits. And scientists at the European Food Safety Agency have given the green light for mealworms to be sold as human foodstuff in the EU. And this, ultimately is a move that means they could appear on supermarket shelves and in kitchens across the continent. It's actually already legal to sell insects as human food in the UK, but the EFSA's ruling is expected to sort of give the meal market as a whole a bit of a boost. And I guess it's a really interesting one because whilst, there are definitely a number of attributes that make mealworms and other insects like an attractive meat or protein substitute with the lower CO2 emissions, reduced water and land requirement than, say, traditional livestock. And, if I were Chris Whitty, I'd be quoting the science says, but, the reality is, will people be able to sort of get over that, the yuck factor, as it were, and kind of integrate them into their diet? But interestingly, it's very much a kind of Western European perception in terms of fearing insects, and they're sort of a proxy for disease. But actually, it was interesting to read that around 80% of the population is actually familiar with insects in their diet globally. So in a way, we're sort of the minority here in Europe. And I just thought it raised an interesting question around how this will be overcome, because it probably feels like insects are going to be a source of protein in our diet going forward. But, what marketing strategies are going to be employed to, I guess, convince us consumers that this is something we do want to eat, or ultimately hide it in our food so we don't know we're eating it, but we're getting the nutritional benefits. So.
I was, again, really fascinated by this one, mainly because I do buy a lot of mealworms, but I put them in the bird feeder. And when I open the backpack pouch, I think, oh, I don't like that smell. So, but I don't know if they're the yellow ones that have just been approved, so there might be a different breed. But you're right in terms of it. But if they're ground up, or either we talk about, don't we, about if it's gone in animal feed or if it's an ingredient in our feed. And you're right, it's about these nutritional benefits. And as we've just been chatting about the Kantar data, people are wanting health, they're wanting sustainability, they're wanting these levers going forward. So if it's a component part, and I liked it, as you say, the yuck factor comment, if we can get over that somehow, then I think it could be branded quite well. But Yeah, definitely personal experience, not quite yet, not in its whole form.
I think branding and turning it into products that we're a little bit more comfortable with, I think, is going to be key. I mean, pet food is another opportunity there, and I think it's quite interesting to see how the discussion around lab-grown meat is also starting to pick up in the pet food sector. Again, it's sort of being seen as a potentially slightly easier route into the market. So I could see, potential for sort of insect protein there as well, and there are startups that are already exploring that as well. And yeah, then I think it's about, do you turn it into a flour? Does it become an addition? Does it add great sustainable protein to something without it being about eating insects? And I think some of the brands that are in the market are really caught in that difficult position because the fact that it's insect protein is their USP. So you want to shout about that, but it does keep it a very novelty sort of niche. And I think in order for that mainstream appeal to happen in countries like the UK, you almost need to stop talking about grubs and stop having little crickets on your packaging and just normalize it a little bit more. It feels like that might be a more productive way to get people to embrace it. But I do appreciate the difficulty that, if you're being super innovative and you're embracing insect protein, you do want to tell consumers about that as well. But yeah, it just keeps it a little bit in that novelty sector, too much for my liking.
And not to trivialise it, but we've spent 20 years watching I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here in this country, where they eat bugs and it's perceived as a bad thing. and it's a trial and it's negative. So, and that'll be in our nation's psyche, like it or not, even if it's a subconscious thing.
Yeah, interestingly, they did say that if you have been to, say, foreign countries where there are insects, like in the markets, where you might have sampled it as like a one-off on holiday, you're more likely to buy sort of an insect-based product, like in your home market, albeit it didn't then go on to say whether or not you choose to repeat purchase. Maybe it's more of a one-off experiment. So, yeah.
I like it. Julia, what's your second pick this week?
My second pick this week is from Sifted, and it's an article titled, "This Startup Has Invented an Ice Cream with Fat You Can't Absorb." So we're keeping with the sort of slight novelty ingredient theme here. The startup in question is Lub Foods from Sweden, which is using a special plant-based fat called EPG, which the body cannot absorb. So when you're using EPG, you can cut up to 92% of calories for each unit of fat in products like ice cream, according to Lub Foods. Now, of course, this is potentially a great benefit given our concern about obesity rates, and of course the sort of wider debate around health and consumer trend or consumer demand for calorie reduction. And the article points out that is a market worth $10 billion a year at the moment, and it's forecast to grow by another $3 billion in 7 years. Much of this market at the moment is focused on sugar reduction, and in fact that's where Lub Foods started out as well. The founder was diagnosed as pre-diabetic, and so initially the company looked at sugar-free NPD, and they do have several products, sugar-free products in the market. But now they're saying fat is becoming more and more of a focus across the industry, and not just in the sense of cutting out fat and replacing it often with sugar, as we have seen in sort of traditional calorie-reduced products, but actually replacing it with new, smarter versions of fat. Fats that deliver pretty good mouthfeel and taste and other sensory properties, but just don't have the same calorie hit. And this product, the Lub Foods EPG ice cream, is now already available in the US and has been since 2019. It's not yet available in Europe, largely because regulators have been slower to approve novel foods, but the company says it's expecting EU approval within the next 2 to 3 years. And I thought this was a really interesting innovation story. I wasn't aware of this particular fat and the potential it has. But I also was really keen to get both of your takes on this, because on the one hand, the article talks about consumer demand for new innovative ingredients that help us, tackle these big challenges like obesity, like health. But on the other hand, we also know that consumers, including in the UK, I would say, can be quite skeptical about anything that sounds like their food has been messed with or that perhaps isn't natural. So how do retailers, how do suppliers square that? How would you expect the UK market to embrace more and more of these smart new ingredients? Or would you expect UK consumers to stay sort of reasonably conservative when it comes to embracing these new ingredients? I don't know, Emily, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one actually, because I think there is that desire to sort of indulge without feeling guilty, but maybe at what cost? Or not what cost, but yeah, depending on that individual's appetite to do something a bit different. But they just want a treat and they don't really care what's in it, or they want a treat that they can trust and they kind of understand, I guess, the ingredients within it. And maybe there is an element of that around education, because I think that's where it comes from, where people are maybe a bit apprehensive. It's a potential risk. This is brand new to market. I don't really know what all these acronyms mean. Often acronyms on the back of the packet are not a good sign. You have additives and all sorts historically. So there may be some nervousness around it, perhaps. But then equally, thinking of sort of lower calorie ice cream like a Halo Top, which clearly everyone is aware of now, has delivered exponential growth with a low calorie ice cream offering. And I don't think too many people there hasn't been too much bad press around what exactly is in this, and therefore I don't want to eat it. It seems like it's provided a solution for consumers that otherwise had a space of very high calorie products, and this sort of ticked the box for something that tasted really good but was slightly better for you. So yeah, we'll see. I guess it depends whether there ends up being any case studies around the EPG and the side effects of it, and I guess where the EFSA get to in terms of their review of the product.
And I totally agree with you, Emily, and I think some trailblazers in that sort of ice cream category, be it Halo Top or Skinny Cow, have given space for more transformation and new product formats. And I guess if it's, and I should have probably looked further, is it in a tub only? Because you think sometimes that's more indulgent and you're not in control of portion size. I definitely aren't when I get the Ben & Jerry's out the freezer with a spoon. But if it's something that's on, like Skinny Cow, more on a stick, and you're thinking it's maybe a midweek treat and the kids are having all these other things, and it's something for maybe and more of an adult market. I don't know, but I think it has got a huge opportunity, and I think, as we've said, the key is in the branding here to simplify the tech and make it clear to consumers that it's nothing to be concerned about. It's, as we spoke about the mealworms, it's had in time it'll have approval, and what that means and how you can feel safe. And I guess maybe I'm being too aspirational here, but we've already mentioned Chris Whitty this show, that do we just need to trust the experts more? And we've had so much time, and by the time this launches in Europe and the UK, we'll have listened to vaccine messages about trust the experts, it's approved, and maybe this is the same for food market. We've approved it, it's fine, it's safe for you to eat, and then that, I guess, allows consumers to buy into things more easy. Maybe that's my rose-tinted spectacles, I'm not sure, but there's maybe an opportunity in there somewhere.
I think it's a really interesting point. I always find that when it comes to food, we have really contradictory impulses on this, though, because yes, on the one hand, I think there can be quite a lot of scaremongering around any form of processing as well. But on the other hand, we are also looking for consumers to take more of an interest in things like provenance. How's my food produced? Where does it come from? Really caring about how that product was created. And it just feels that level of engagement still happens a little bit more naturally around processes that we can really understand and that we could potentially reproduce in our own kitchens. It just helps to get our heads around what this product is and why we can trust it. And I think it's going to be a really big challenge. And as you both said, branding and really breaking down the sort of slightly scary sounding science, I think will have to play a really big part in that, so that even though it's a process you can't do in your own kitchen, and it's an ingredient you can't buy in the supermarket that you're not familiar with, you trust it because you understand how it's been approved and the function it plays in the food. And I suppose if ultimately it means that you can have guilt-free ice cream, that might also be the selling point that then does it. Nora, what's your second pick for us?
My second pick this week is from the grocer, and it's PepsiCo and Beyond Meat launch win-win joint venture. And unsurprisingly, anything that has meat in the title I'm always keen to have a look at. So this is a bit of a surprise joint venture between Beyond Meat and PepsiCo. And this is helping PepsiCo have more of a plant-based offering across snacking and beverage. And I was interested just to do a bit of my own research to understand, particularly US side, how much of PepsiCo in the meat market. And apart from beef jerky, not a lot. So this isn't, as we've seen other joint ventures happen, with the likes of McDonald's and Beyond Meat, this isn't a big, strong meat player that's wanting a meat-free option brought into their portfolio. This is quite an unusual coupling. So the article goes on to say the joint venture will look around a new range of products looking at sustainability, ethical sourcing and health. Particularly in the US market, it's quoting 1 in 5 US customers are considering ethical sourced ingredients, particularly as a priority for their buying behaviour in 2021. So as I say, win-win. Beyond Meat allows them to grow, and it allows PepsiCo to diversify. But it just seems such an unusual coupling, and not only, I guess, for organisations that are in very different categories, but also culturally as well. You have this big US FMCG player, and obviously Beyond Meat is worth the $12 billion now, so a big player in its own right. Share prices went up 20% when this was announced, but just, you've got Ethan Brown leading Beyond Meat, talking this week at a UN conference about the perception of meat, and actually if we change our perception of meat, eating vegetables offers exactly the same thing. So it's PepsiCo really nailing the colours to the mast here. So I think it's going to be a fascinating one to watch and see what new products come out of this Planet partnership.
I thought it was interesting as well, just the fact that they chose to go down the JV route, because I think PepsiCo do have a couple of smaller funds, I guess, allocated to these kind of startups where they can have a minority investment. So I guess creating a joint venture was actually quite a departure from that as well, which I thought was quite interesting and clearly like a much bigger, bolder move by PepsiCo into this space. And the point you mentioned around culture, I guess it always comes up when sort of large FMCG players choose to acquire some of these smaller startup, high growth businesses. And, one that came to mind a couple of months ago was obviously in November with Nestle securing a majority stake in Mindful Chef. And it's that marriage of different priorities and ways of working, I guess, and how you don't suffocate the innovation and the startup-ness of the business, but equally you're looking to try and integrate it into a much larger organization.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely fascinating tie-up, and as you both said, I just want to see what products they're going to come up with. I mean, I suppose we think Beyond Meat and we think burger alternatives, but of course, that market is really moving away from that. Beyond Meat's own product range, particularly in the US, is much wider than that now. PepsiCo obviously is in snacking. Beyond Meat was one of the companies that really pioneered use of yellow split peas. They have fantastic expertise and fantastic supply chain relationships in that. Are there opportunities there in snacking to use what is a really high protein crop that's gained a lot of currency in some of the NPD? I think that's potentially something that would be quite interesting. And I suppose you are also in a JV like that, really getting a front row seat as PepsiCo to what is driving that market. You are being talked through and you're learning the category through one of the pioneers in that category. I imagine that in and of itself must be hugely valuable. I recently wrote an article for The Grocer about growth prospects in plant-based. And one of the things I was really struck by was that when people were talking about, where's that next wave of growth going to come from, it really isn't necessarily going to be in those meat alternatives, those sort of classic products that start at the trend, because how many plant-based burgers can you ultimately engage consumers with? And it is much more about driving that trend into other categories beyond chilled, more into frozen, where we've already seen Bird's Eye obviously working really hard, more ambient products. It's your Hellman vegan variant, as opposed to necessarily yet another patty. So that would be my expectation. I'm thinking snacking and using some of that yellow pea production expertise perhaps to see what you can do with those sort of plant-based products in PepsiCo's offering. But yeah, it'll be fascinating to see. Emily, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to have some lively debate about the latest trends, so thank you.
We've loved it. Thank you.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.